So, The Crown is back, Series 4, The Machinations of Our Monarchy. I wonder if you're watching it and how far you've got. I've only seen the first so far. I tell you, there is no nation on earth more hooked on that series than America. They are so proud to have broken free from the trappings of our monarchy back in the revolutionary 1770s, and yet they are still intrigued, fascinated, I'd even say obsessed, and have been ever since. You only have to watch Hamilton to see how the themes don't grow tired, do they? Overplayed as they are by the brilliant Jonathan Groff as King George III, singing "You'll Be Back." It's my favourite song in that musical, and I give you full permission, if you don't know it, to pause this YouTube and go and Google it to watch it before coming back. It's my favourite song, and it's one that's full of parody at the moment, is it not? You'll find those versions as well by people who are exasperated with the exercise of democracy just now. So the fascination and fear of empire, what's it about? I think it has to do with the exercise of power. And that's where I want to pay attention today as we celebrate Christ the King. I want to explore what Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46, what they reveal about Jesus' exercise of kingship. We're looking at the last chunk of a long section of Jesus teaching the disciples on the Mount of Olives. 2 chapters that began with the disciples asking about the end of the age. And here, at the end of the age, Jesus describes the Son of Man seated in glory, surrounded by angels attending him. His everlasting reign builds on the picture from the Old Testament that describes God's reign. Look at Isaiah 6 as an example. And that divine reign then finds its echoes in the reigns of the human kings, David and so on. And that also picks up on other contemporary notions of royal grandeur from the ancient world, which are still relevant today. And arrayed around this lofty throne are the countless loyal subjects paying homage. And we glimpse the one who wears the crown, offering edicts and exercising judgment, separating the sheep from the goats, the worthy from the unworthy, judgments which are final once issued. That is, there's no scope for negotiation or appeal. The reference to the king's subjects as sheep and goats possibly reinforces that sense of power versus powerlessness. In that part of the world, certainly to an untrained eye such as mine, sheep and goats look remarkably similar to each other, which is to say, at least to the outsider, the exercise of judgment presents as rather random, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. On the one hand, here is recognised the ultimate power of this king to judge as he wills, as he sees fit. But I suggest to you that's as far as the classic stereotype of royal power goes here in Matthew 25. Yes, Jesus is king, absolutely and eternally, but it turns out he is utterly different from any king you've ever heard of before. Why? He explains his criteria for the separation of the sheep from goats. It's directly related to the way his subjects treat him when he is hungry, when he is thirsty, when he's excluded, when he's naked, when he's sick or in prison. What? The king left hungry and thirsty? A king being othered and stripped? His Majesty in hospital or in prison? These things aren't relevant to someone who has the means of protection and the wherewithal for prosperity. Don't be ridiculous. The king is in his royal palace, dining at that long table, robed in ermine. It doesn't make sense. He has all the larders and wardrobes in the world. His guards serve to defend his freedom, not to enforce lockdown. It's just not possible. Jesus dares us to imagine this king on the other side of the tram lines. He stretches us to imagine a figure who sets aside his throne for the sake of the poor. At the same time, he challenges our distinctions between the haves and the have-nots, between the powerful and the powerless, between the deserving and the undeserving, not least because the kind of king that Jesus is one who knows hunger and thirst and exclusion and exposure and sickness and imprisonment. We can read that literally in terms of what happens to Jesus in Jerusalem on his way to crucifixion. Each of those 6 conditions are part of the account. And we can read it metaphorically in the sense that Jesus so fully identifies with people in these 6 circumstances that he is there. He's always there. Such is the extent to which he is Emmanuel, God with us. I'm reminded of Matt Redman's beautiful lyrics. You laid aside your majesty, gave up everything for me. Can't go that low. Suffered at the hands of those you had created. That is to say, the way Jesus exercises power is totally different to any king you've ever imagined before. From here on, this is what the exercise of power in Jesus' name looks like. No lording over, no looking down, rather a coming alongside, even a looking up. In God's kingdom, you will find the king with the least, the last, and the lost. Let anyone who claims a position of authority or anyone climbing that greasy pole beware. This preacher speaks to herself first and foremost. With Jesus, power and vulnerability sit together. And those who thought they knew better, those familiar with authority, those who were articulate and good at raising debate, are pushing back. But Lord, when was it we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? When was it we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? When was it we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? They don't get it. Whether they don't listen and can't hear, or whether they can or don't want to imagine Jesus in such a place of vulnerability, I leave to your imagination. But for sure, in their defensiveness, they've just increased the distance and the distinction between the haves and the have-nots, the powerful and the powerless, by their very reaction. A move, of course, which consciously or unconsciously reinforces the power of the powerful and increases the vulnerability of the vulnerable. Here are people who seem more interested in talking about social dynamics than challenging them, more interested in reflecting on pastoral need than responding to it, more interested in winning an argument than rolling up their sleeves. And so the king spells it out in words of 1 syllable. Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these members of my family, you did it to me. We have here not only a critique of power and some advocacy for social action, there's also something important here about safeguarding the vulnerable. Yes, I mean safeguarding, in all the senses that ICSA has recently shown us just how much we have to learn and heed. Here we glimpse King Jesus exercising his power for the well-being of those most vulnerable. He knows his power, he owns his power, and he shares his power with those most disempowered. We may not all be kings or bishops. We may feel powerless. Yet, whoever we are, we all have some power. Power to choose, power that can be exercised for good, or power that can wittingly or unwittingly cause harm. And so the gospel challenges us. How do we wield it? Does it serve the well-being of those most vulnerable? There's nothing more dangerous than the denial of our own power, yet it happens all the time, because each of us knows more keenly our sense of powerlessness in the areas where we feel vulnerable. Of course we do. But the challenge is to recognize and use our power, not for self-protection, but for the protection of others, to give it away. Are we ready, I wonder, to cultivate the habit of looking beyond ourselves, to listen and see and protect those who may be truly most vulnerable? It happens in the most surprising places, even in the corridors of power. Prompted by Netflix and their portrayal in The Crown, I would point to an example of such vulnerability. I'm thinking of Princess Diana. A complicated case, for sure, yet who could have seen what we now suppose to be true prior to Andrew Morton's biography? Power and vulnerability are not as far removed as we may like to suppose. Someone who on the outside is dressed in finery, designed by Bruce Oldfield and all that, and on the inside is hungry and desperate, sick and feeling imprisoned. Jesus would urge us not to be surprised at who may be vulnerable, genuinely vulnerable. It may be hard to see, it may well be disguised, but do not too easily distinguish those with power from those who are vulnerable. They sit close. It is possible to have power, yet to feel powerless. It is possible to be vulnerable and to exercise power. Indeed, I think both of those are very common, and sometimes dangerously so. Jesus doesn't deny his power, nor does he forego his power. Despite his power, he knows powerlessness, not least from harsh experience, and he chooses to exercise his power for the sake of the vulnerable, not in self-interest, but for the benefit of others. Meanwhile, at that time, when Christ the King is found back on his throne, exercising his powers of judgment over sheep and goats, over you and me, don't be trapped into thinking for one moment you're powerless to affect that judgment. The very fact that this king is not yet back is a gift we are offered, the gift of time, of opportunity, of empowerment, to seek out his face among those least likely to know that God is with them, Emmanuel, to impact their circumstances, and in turn to impact our own, perhaps forever.